Each year, more than 46 million Americans will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental injury, most of which are preventable. So, what are your risks, and who can you trust to protect you? This is Safety Matters with Russ Kenzior.
This is America's Slip and Fall Guy.
And this is Tony B.
Welcome to the show. So, Tony.
Safety Matters in the news.
What's in the news, Russ?
You like that sound, don't
Yes,
you?
I do.
Yeah, Safety Matters in the news. Coronavirus remains in the news. Interesting little news item that came from the CDC. This is reported by CNN. And the story is titled Updated CDC Guidance Acknowledges Coronavirus Can Be Spread Through the Air.
But didn't we know that already?
Well, there's a little twist, let me tell you. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention updated guidance just this week on its website to say coronavirus can commonly spread, quote, through respiratory droplets and small particles, such as those in aerosols, which are produced even when a person breathes. Remember, before, it used to be coughing and sneezing. Right, no more. Now it's just breathing. The story goes on to say these particles can cause infection when inhaled into the nose, mouth, airways, and lungs. It's thought that these are the main pathways for the virus to spread. There's growing evidence that droplets and airborne particles can remain suspended in the air and be breathed in by others and travel distances beyond 6 feet. For example, during choir practice in restaurants or fitness classes.
Did they say where the study came from?
No, they did not. But the CDC's page did say that in general, indoor environments without good ventilation increase the risk. So, here we go. Back to masks. And if it's true that you can contract coronavirus by simply breathing, then the vast majority of face masks or face covers are rendered useless because most of them cannot filter a particle the size of the coronavirus. In fact, I use the analogy. It's like saying, I'm going to put a chain link fence around my yard to keep mosquitoes out.
Won't work.
Ain't going to work. I mean, unless you're wearing an N95 mask, it cannot physically remove the size of, 0.015 micrometer size coronavirus?
If you're wearing the mask correctly.
Well, you have to have the right mask, wear it correctly, don't touch it.
Right.
There's a lot of ifs. But if what the CDC is saying, which probably is true, just breathing is going to spread this coronavirus, then the whole issue of face masks, although interesting, and if you're wearing the right one would certainly have some impact, the vast majority would not. So people walking around with face masks, guess what? Don't work.
Don't breathe.
Don't breathe. And again, they talk about restaurants. And in fact, there's another story that came out from the New York Post about the airlines, because they mention airlines.
Oh, they pick on the airlines again.
Go. Yeah, 11,000. According to the CDC, 11,000 people may have been exposed to COVID-19 on airplanes. The story says that thousands of people may have been exposed to COVID-19 on airplanes, according to the CDC. Agency officials believe nearly 11,000 people may have been exposed to one of the 1,600 known cases of people flying while contagious with the virus, despite being unable to confirm a single case of viral transmission on a U.S. plane. And again, there you go. CDC's making a statement that up to 11,000 people
were infected.
It actually says have been exposed.
Right.
So they're being very specific. They're saying this had happened. But then when you kind of break it down, they don't really have any evidence, any data. It says this is interesting, an absence of cases identified or reported is not evidence that there were no cases.
Oh, so let's just do a hypothetical theory.
So if we don't have any evidence that there were no cases, that doesn't mean there really weren't no cases. So it's like proving a false, positive. CDC spokeswoman Caitlin Shockey told the Washington Post this week, which first published the stats. She went on to say CDC is not able to definitively determine that potential cases were associated or were not associated with the exposure in the air cabin or through air travel, given the numerous opportunities for potential exposure associated with the entire travel journey. And, of course, widespread global distribution of the virus. And that's true. I mean, from the minute you get into the airport, you may have contracted the virus, right? I mean, there's so many ways and so many ifs. But again, confusion. And it brings up the face masks yet again. Did you know this past week, Tony? You're a sports fan, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you know that 3 head coaches, NFL head coaches, were fined, and their teams totaling over $1 million in fines for not wearing face masks? It says here, this is from Fox News, the NFL has issued fines amounting to over $1 million to teams and head coaches for breaking with the league's coronavirus protocols last week after 3 coaches were spotted without masks on the sidelines. Now, these are football fields, very large stadiums. If I'm not mistaken, everybody, the coaching staff, assistant coaches, and all the players are tested like daily.
Every day, yes.
So let's kind of go with that. Everyone's been tested. There's nobody in the stands. Everyone's testing negative. You're in a ginormous stadium, an outdoor stadium.
Yes.
And because you didn't wear a mask,
you're being penalized.
Big time penalties.
Sounds like they need the money.
ESPN's Adam Schefter broke the story late Monday, reporting that Denver's Vic Fangio, Seattle's Pete Carroll, and San Francisco's Kyle Shanahan were all hit with $100,000 fines. Schefter cited unnamed sources who said their teams were also hit with $250,000 fines. In all, the league issued $1.05 million in fines for not wearing a mask in an outdoor stadium, even though everybody's been tested and is not contagious. So, New York Post put out a story that said almost 90% of New York City's bars and restaurants couldn't pay August's rent.
Of course, they're not open.
Yeah.
Where are they going to get the revenue from?
There you go. Nearly 90% of New York City's bars and restaurant owners could not pay their rent in August, heightening the continued crush the coronavirus shutdown has inflicted on Gotham's economy. 87% of bars, restaurants, nightclubs, and even event spaces in the 5 boroughs could not pay their full August rent, according to data from 457 businesses surveyed between August 25th and September 11th. This is a study, by the way, put out by the New York City Hospitality Alliance, which is a non-for-profit group. Quote, restaurants, bars, and nightlife venues have been financially devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before the pandemic, where businesses were operating at 100% occupancy, these small businesses were struggling to stay open. Now we're seeing widespread closures. Approximately 150,000 industry workers are still out of their jobs. And the overwhelming majority of these are small businesses. They can't afford to pay the rent.
Yeah, it's a shame.
It's been devastating. When asked if landlords in New York were waiving rent in relation to COVID-19 hardships, just 40% of businesses responded in the affirmative. 28.5% said less than 50% of their rental obligation was waived in August. 43% said that 50%. And 28.5% they were given a break on more than half of their rental fees. So there's some help, but all in all, man, it's just killing the city. And by the way, New York is known to be the place you go for what?
Entertainment.
And food.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, Broadway, I mean, the hotels, everything is all centered around
travel.
Yeah. And they're pretty much out of business.
They're toast.
They're in bad shape. And the lockdown, and again, this is the point, regardless of what side you're on, there's consequences. Right. That's the point. The point is if you shut down the city and you say we're doing it to protect people, well, there are people who are going to be impacted by that financially, their businesses, their livelihood, their careers. And we can just keep going on and on. Suicide, depression, divorce. Those are all the consequences. And so you say, well, wait a minute now. Before we go out and start shutting down, mandating shutdowns, we better understand what we got here.
Yeah, they didn't get the coronavirus, but the guy is like he's in the food lines.
Have you heard the public service announcement that was put out this week by our Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams?
So if we want to get back to school, back to work, back to worship, and back to overall health, there are things our country needs to do. We need to follow state and local guidelines, take extra precautions if at higher risk, wash our hands frequently, stay 6 feet from others when we can, and when we can't stay 6 feet from others, please, I'm begging you, wear a face covering. These small actions will make a big difference. So I'm asking you to say it with me, America. Coronavirus stops with me. You can learn more at coronavirus.gov.
Say it with me.
Yeah.
Coronavirus.
Stay with me.
Stay with me. And, I got to tell you, when I heard that, I was really a bit embarrassed.
Yeah. He sounded like he was.
I mean, really?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, here's
The sky is falling.
I mean, when you look at it, just at face value.
Please, I'm begging you, wear a face covering.
I'm begging you.
Please, I'm begging you, wear a face covering.
They don't work, Doc. All right. Hey. Your website says they don't really work. Okay. And by the way, you notice face covering. Face covering. This is where we are today. But anyhow, when we come back, we're going to cover some of the recalls going on, and we got some really interesting interviews today with some local officials who are running for city council here in the city of Southlake. So we're going to cover a lot of ground when Safety Matters returns. Back to the show. We had some interesting product recalls this week from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. First one is, actually the first three are quite interesting. They're all related to fall prevention. The first one is Pedigo. Pedigo recalls electric bikes due to fall hazard. I've actually seen this bike. It's an improperly manufactured electrical cable that when you plug it in to charge, it can cause the bicycle to accelerate unexpectedly, posing a fall hazard to the user.
Let me get this. It's made in China.
Well, yes, it is. It is made in China. But Pedigo has recalled about 11,600 of these bicycles. So that's the first recall. We got several more. Caravan Global recalls chairs due to fall and injury hazards. These have been sold exclusively here in Texas at HEB.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. Caravan Sports has a padded arm-bagged chair, and it says the chair's plastic bracket can bend or fail and cause the fabric seat to rip apart from the frame, posing fall and injury hazards to the user. This is sold through HEB stores throughout this year, 2020. It goes for about $20, and guess where it's made? In China. So, third recall, fall-related also, is a Specialized Bicycle Components recalls its Sirius bicycles and alloy cranks due to fall and injury hazards. The crank arm can disengage and cause the bicycle's rider to lose control, posing fall and injury hazards. Consumers should stop using the recalled bicycles immediately. Contact your nearest authorized specialty retailer for a free repair. About 36,000 sold in the United States, 3,200 in Canada, and these are not made in, well, they're kind of made in China, made in Taiwan. The last recall is one that is particularly interesting to me, and this is the Cobalt brand 40-volt lithium-ion cordless electric chainsaws. I don't know if you have a chainsaw, Tony, but the chainsaw can remain in the on position, posing a laceration hazard to consumers. Nothing like having the chainsaw just kind of stay on.
It's not funny. It's not funny.
Yeah.
And where are these made?
Well, it says the consumer should immediately stop using the recalled chainsaws and contact Hong Kong Sunrise Trading for a free repair. That's interesting. By the way, they also make a a Cobalt brand 40-volt lithium ion 12-inch cordless electric chainsaw that has the same problem in terms of its engaging. But it's put out by Cobalt, and if I'm not mistaken, isn't that sold at like Lowe's stores?
I think
Lowe's,
so.
yeah, Lowe's. It says here Lowe's has been selling them from 2014 through March of 2020, manufactured in China. So we continue to get dangerous products from the country of China. Tony, it's election season. We have early voting coming up here in a couple of weeks. We have an general election, national, state, local, in first week of November. So, one of the things that keeps coming up is public safety. Public safety is probably, I got to imagine, in every race, the number one issue on people's minds. Safety, public safety. And it comes in different shapes and sizes. Coronavirus, what's our government officials, state, local, federal, going to do to protect us? Public safety.
Right.
I would think public safety is probably the biggest item right now.
Sure.
And here in Southlake, Texas, which for those of you who may have heard about Southlake but don't really know a lot about us, Southlake has a population, according to the 2019 census, of 32,376 people. Got about 10% of us are over the age of 65. 50.6% of the residents of Southlake, Texas are women. So we have more women than men. A lot of folks own their homes here, 92%. Medium housing value is quite stunning, $656,100. So a lot of expensive homes in Southlake, Texas. But, what people don't necessarily know about Southlake, Texas is the business side. We have over 3,485 businesses. 1,959 are owned by men, 822 by women, and 676 businesses in Southlake, Texas are minority owned. So we have a very diverse community, considering the fact we only have a land area of about 22 square miles. 2.2% of Southlake residents are in poverty. And the median household income, what do you think the median household income is in Southlake?
150.
God, I was so excited to use the other button. $230,700. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if you're listening, Southlake is probably, on the upper end of the income scale, but, it's like every other town. What happens in Southlake probably is no different than what happens in neighboring communities or communities across the country, right?
Agreed.
I mean, we're all Americans.
Right.
And so I thought, here we are coming up into an election season. And I want to know where my local officials or your local officials stand on public safety.
Absolutely.
Right?
What happens if a riot or something
what happens?
Breaks out?
Everybody talks about lower taxes and reducing traffic, and we don't want this, we don't like that. Okay, well, great. What about safety? Nobody's asking those questions. No one's asking if their elected officials anything about public safety.
But Russ, we're asking.
Yeah, and we will ask.
Amen.
Coming up, we're going to be interviewing 2 city council people, candidates for city council.
But we invited all of them, right?
We invited all 4, and Kathy Talley, who's running for place 1, had accepted. And Randy Williamson, who's running for place 6, had accepted, and their opponents chose not to be interviewed. And so when Safety Matters returns, we're going to be interviewing our local political people running for local office in Southlake, Texas, the kind of questions that most communities should be asking their elected officials, specifically about public safety.
So what questions are we going to ask them?
Well, we're going to ask them questions like, what would you do if we had a flash mob show up in town?
That's a good one.
Just out of the blue, social media brings together hundreds of people who spontaneously just show up, not necessarily to have a peaceful protest, but to riot, create some act of violence, draw media attention. Why would we think that wouldn't happen here? Because it can happen anywhere. It happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
I don't even know where Kenosha is.
Right.
Never heard of it.
A lot of people don't even know where Wisconsin is. But in Kenosha, Wisconsin, it happened. And not just big cities. It can happen anywhere.
That's right. It's rural America, right?
Right.
Small town.
Right. So as that is happening in small towns, why would we think it wouldn't happen in Southlake, Texas, or any other community for that? But, questions like that.
What other questions?
Well, we talk about coronavirus. A lot of the cities, townships in Texas.
Like masks and everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you were given the opportunity as a city council person to mandate the wearing of masks, would you do it? Now, we understand today the reality is our governor's mandated mask wearing.
Right.
But there was a time period, Tony, where it wasn't mandated. It was voluntary.
That's right.
And then it changed. And so I'm just curious, are we still in a free country? Do people still have rights?
Yeah.
I mean, or is it mandated where, we're going to shut you down for your own good based on science that's inconclusive? Oh, by the way, we're going to destroy your business. We're going to drive the drug abuse problem through the roof, suicide rates, right? Divorce.
So that's another good question. We're going to ask that, ask that one?
Yeah, we are going to ask that. Yeah, and really, are you for defending or defunding the police?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, which side are you on? I just want to know.
Yeah, I agree.
And so we're going to ask those questions of two elected officials that will be coming on the show here shortly when Safety Matters returns. Welcome back to the show. This is Russ Kenzior, joined by my producer, Tony. And we are interviewing Ms. Kathy Talley, who is running for Southlake City Council Place 1. Welcome to the show, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Russ.
I think we would all agree that the number one issue in this election cycle is public safety. I mean, it's been going on across the country in many different shapes and forms, and public safety comes in a whole lot of different shapes and sizes. As a city council person, I would assume this would be probably the most important job you would have, is protecting the people that you lead in your city.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you again for doing this for all of us candidates. It's super important, I think, to give our residents every opportunity possible to hear us, because with COVID, as you know, the in-person opportunities are quite limited. So safety is huge, and whenever you want me to get to that, I can speak to my involvement already with safety in our city and in our community.
Yeah,
it's hugely important to me.
Let's start with coronavirus. You brought up coronavirus. Yep. That's on everybody's mind, whether we like it or not. And we do a lot of segments on coronavirus. But it's Southlake, like every city, has been devastated by the coronavirus shutdown. Our business community, homes, schools, everyone's been affected. Pretty much typical to every other community across the country. But back in June, if you remember, Governor Abbott issued a statement regarding the wearing of face masks or face covers, and said that the decisions about wearing masks in public remain the choice of the individual, and it was up to the counties to decide whether or not to mandate wearing of masks. This is in June. Later in the month of June, on the 26th, Tarrant County mandated that employees and visitors had to wear masks when in a business setting. And not that long afterwards, Colleyville, our neighboring community, Mayor Richard Newton issued a statement saying that the city will not adopt any formal action regarding mandating the wearing of face masks, and that he wouldn't comply, which our Judge Glenn Whitney, county commissioner, was, quote, disappointed. Now, of course, all that came to an end in July when our governor mandated that everybody has to wear a face. So it's been this struggle. And regardless of party, regardless of politics, there's been this back and forth on who do you trust and what the heck is going on. You mentioned your background on safety, and that's awesome. If you were to go back in time, or kind of where we are today, here we are in late September, how would you have reacted as a city council person? Mandating masks, don't wear masks, just give us a background. How would you have handled that?
And it's difficult. And I've watched the online struggle. People are very passionate on both sides of the issue. It really feels like there's no middle ground, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I think from a city perspective, from a leadership perspective, you have to set the tone for everyone. And for me, it's really irregardless of how I personally feel about it. It's what's best for everyone. And so I think about my parents. One of them has underlying health conditions, and the last thing I want to do, or I want any of us to do, is put them in danger. And so I think our cities and our city needs to take a leadership role and say, look, this is what the county, the state, the federal government has said is best for all of us. Let's just do it and move through it. And the city has done a fantastic job of supporting our businesses in this process. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Southlake Safe program that they've instituted. It's a pretty recent initiative. They've done an amazing job of coming up with initiatives to help our businesses make it through. As you mentioned, Russ, so many of them are struggling, and some of them are already gone. They couldn't even make it 6 or 8 months, which is terrible, especially when some of them have been here a long time. So I think from a leadership perspective, leadership role, we set the standard, we set the tone, and trying to get in the weeds, as it were. Is this best? Is this best? We have to do what's best for everyone in our city. And if the county, state, and federal government are saying wear a mask, let's just wear a mask and move on. Everybody's different.
Right.
But everybody's safety is paramount, in my opinion.
Well, that's the key. That's what we're trying to get at, is how do we protect every member of our general public, from children to the elderly, which Southlake, interestingly, has almost 10% of its population is over 65.
Yes, and it's interesting. I have a lot of friends who have moved their parents here. Their parents want to be close to their grandkids and their kids, and it is a large population. And the other thing about wearing masks is you don't know what each individual person, how they feel about that. And so if you have businesses that are participating in the Southlake Safe program, that allows everyone to know and feel comfortable that they can go into that business. Does that make sense? So it doesn't mean every business has to participate, but those that do, it's just one more step in helping them manage through this.
Right. Another topic that's been captivating a lot of attention, that's the mass protests, rioting that's going on across the country, flash mobs, whatever you want to call them. But it's a lot of violence in cities and towns, inflicting a lot of pain, violence, and cost. Southlake, by the grace of God, hasn't been touched by that yet, but it may. And, when you're running for city council, you have your issues that you want to address, but it's always the case where something will happen that's not planned.
Right.
And that's where we, as members of the community, look to our leaders to solve those problems. And this is one of them. But, in light of the reality of social unrest, what would you do to protect the people of Southlake from the risk of violent protests, and at the same time protect the right of individuals who want to peacefully protest?
Right. It's a huge issue. I mean, that's really underplaying it or downplaying it, right? It's massive. I think that the key in all of this is prevention, risk management. I've spoken with Assistant Police Chief Casey and other members of our Department of Public Safety, and we are extremely prepared. I have every confidence in their ability to respond quickly. They have a huge, massive coordinated effort with our other local area police and fire departments, which is huge. It's hugely important, so that if you need to have more than just our department responding, if it's a larger event, they are a phone call or the comm. They're very quickly accessible. And they've coordinated those efforts before. And I just feel very confident in our DPS, in their ability to handle anything, whether it's planned or unplanned. And as you know, normally protests, peaceful protests, which I also support. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that we have the right to do that in our country. There's so many countries, I think sometimes, not this year, but we take those things for granted, right? But we can do that in our country. But to have a peaceful protest, you have to get a permit for that. And so the city knows that you're coming, and they want to protect the protesters as well as our residents. And so you make it a safe place for everybody.
No, agreed. So on the subject of defending or defunding the police, which side do you fall on?
Oh, defending. I am a huge supporter of our police department. In working with Art in the Square for several years now, I work closely with them. If you can imagine, a 3-day art festival is a massive coordinated effort between several entities, and I have a lot of experience in doing that. You have festival goers that come from all over our country, And it's important for all of us to make sure that everybody involved is safe, and that involves our fantastic men and women that serve in our Department of Public Safety. So I would never support defunding the police. I love our SRO program in our schools. Keeping those kids, our most precious commodity, safe is of utmost importance to me.
Last question. You mentioned kids. We have a growing, like every community, sadly, we have a growing epidemic of opioid addictions and teen suicide. Any thoughts on how you might work with the school district to help reduce that ever-growing epidemic?
It's tough. One of the things our school district is already doing is they've just recently brought on staff 2 intervention counselors. A lot of people probably don't know that those counselors are not funded by the state of Texas. And so my work with the Carroll Education Foundation, we've been able to help the district fund these positions that aren't funded by the state. And it's important having those counselors allows you to communicate with those kids on a regular basis. And I mean, it's I don't want to end the segment by saying this, but it is what it is. It's terrible that I have to say that I have friends who have lost their children to suicide. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, and we have to do more. And I'm committed to that. When you experience it like that on a personal level, it just takes on so much more meaning. And so I look forward to coming up with more programs and ways that we can interact with those kids and get them in their most desperate time of need, really.
No, we appreciate it. I've been speaking with Kathy Talley, who's a candidate for Place 1, Southlake City Council. I want to thank you for coming out to the show this morning.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Welcome back. This is Russ Kenzior. I'm here with my producer, Tony.
Welcome back.
And we have a second guest today, Randy Williamson, who is running for Place 6 on the city of Southlake's City Council. Welcome to the show, Randy.
Thank you, Russ. Tony, I'm excited to be here. Appreciate being your guest.
No,
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks. All the polls, whether it's local, national, state, whatever, are all showing that safety, public safety, is the most important issue on voters' minds, regardless of party and regardless of the issue, whether it's coronavirus, protests, whatever it might be. Public safety, the policing has become a big deal. So we really want to focus today's show on safety, since that's our premise, beginning with coronavirus. As you know, the coronavirus outbreak has been devastating to every city, including Southlake. I don't know how many millions or billions of dollars we've lost, but it's been a lot. But there's been some controversy. Back in June, Governor Abbott issued a statement regarding wearing of face masks and said that the decisions ultimately remained in, the public's choice, whether or not an individual wanted to wear a face mask, and that counties can ultimately decide whether or not to mandate the wearing of masks in businesses. Well, the end of that month, on June 26, Tarrant County mandated that employees and visitors had to wear masks when you're in a business setting. And it wasn't really that long after, Randy, that Colleyville Mayor Richard Newton issued his statement, which caught international and national attention, saying that the city would not adopt any formal action requiring the wearing of face masks and wouldn't enforce it. And of course, in July, the governor of Texas mandated face masks. So there's been this kind of controversy about face masks. And I think here in Texas, most people just don't like being told what to do.
Sure.
And there's a controversy whether or not they even work. But if you were to go back in time, how would you approach the face mask issue as a city council person?
Yeah, it's a great question, Russ. So, I think in some ways it's a little bit unfair to say go back in time, right? Because hindsight's 20/20 often. And I will say, I think leaders have tried to do their level best. I mean, they've been dealing with a pandemic, an outbreak that is a once in a lifetime or once in multiple generations type of situation. So I extend some grace on that. They're doing the absolute best they can. That said, as an elected official, whether you're the president, whether you're the governor, state legislator, or a council person, I think you've got you have you need to be responsible, but you need to be measured as well. I think you take lots of data points into consideration and make the level best decision you can for your constituents and residents. So, for instance, we look at masks in particular, like you're talking about. You mentioned it. We don't know for certain what the impact of that is. When we began this whole process back in the spring, it was about flattening the curve. Everybody heard about flattening the curve, and by having some degrees of government shutdowns and limiting movement around the general populous areas, we were successful in doing that. But I think it's important as an elected official that you stay true to what your task was, and that's where I think we've gotten a little bit maybe out of focus. We're beyond now flattening the curve. Now it's about just day-to-day activity and what's the role of government in that. So, I think that where I stand on this is that if we can look back retrospectively and perhaps learn from some of these decisions, we'll be far more prepared in the future to make the right decisions every step of the way. So it's difficult. It's a difficult one. I think I'm always going to lean towards allowing people to have personal choice as much as possible, not an irresponsible personal choice. I think we have to listen to medical experts. We have to consider that information, absolutely. But at the end of the day, I'm going to always lean towards considering professional information, the healthcare experts, but also allowing people to make some individual choices and decisions that are good for them and their family.
Well, after all, public policy is to be created by public officials, not the medical community. I mean, they're supplying their input.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but they're not the decision maker. And that's kind of where we've been as a country,
right.
Is the medical people, specifically the CDC and National Institutes of Health, have been creating public policy.
Yeah, and I think what I've heard from residents and some frustrations when I receive phone calls are on things that they perceive to be very inconsistent. I think inconsistency is a big issue here as well. So, for instance, you go into a restaurant, it seems that from the hostess stand to your table, that 15 to 20 foot walk, it's critical that you have your mask on. But once you're there, you can take your mask off and there seems to be no more risk, and I say that somewhat tongue in cheek. But the point is we do need to have some level of consistency. Why is it that we can gather as groups outdoors, no masks, no problems, depending on what activity you're in, but then perhaps, you're indoors at a school event or something like that, and you have to have a mask on. So there appears to be learning opportunities as we look back on this entire terrible time, to where perhaps we'll be better at it if we're ever faced with this again.
And we may be.
We could be.
You mentioned outside gatherings. The country's also been just under plague with these alarming rates of spontaneous protests, these flash mobs, people showing up organized to create mayhem. We've seen an increase in crime costing billions of dollars in violence. I mean, people are getting shot and killed by these protests that just pop up out of nowhere. What would you do, Randy, to protect the citizens of Southlake from the risk of violent protests, while at the same time protecting their right of individuals to peacefully protest?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Constitution protects that right to peacefully protest. Let's be clear on that. They absolutely have that right to do that, and I will always stand behind our Constitution 100%. So that said, I want to mention one thing first. You mentioned kind of the pop-up violent event that might occur and that type of thing. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is our police department here in Southlake and what we do from a public safety standpoint. Having served on council for 6 years, I was intimately involved in that. We have two major events a year. Stars and Stripes on the 4th of July. You have the lighting of the Christmas tree, of the holiday in the town square at Christmas. And those events take serious planning. We don't just show up and have Christmas cookies and sing carols at those things, or have barbecue at the 4th of July event. We have operations teams that work well in advance of that. That's the city manager's office, that's public works, that's police, and they are coordinated with a very tight safety standard for those events. Now, let me say, we can't guarantee safety on every occurrence. Nobody can. Right. We know that. But we can do our level best as elected officials to ensure that we're providing the safest environment possible. And I can tell you a couple things without going into too much detail, but in events like that, our people should feel safe knowing that we have officers positioned positioned in different places within our town square that are absolutely prepared to take action if necessary, if something were to break out unexpected, God forbid a terrorism event or something like that. They're prepared for that. In addition to that, little things like you may have noticed in years past that you would see the orange and white traffic barriers, blocking access into town hall or into town square. Those now are filled with water. And there's a reason for that, because we know things like automobile, people trying to use an automobile to cause damage or mayhem, that'll block that and so forth. So we've got a lot of things in preparation for those planned events. But for your question specifically, Russ, you talked about the unplanned type event. I can tell you that our folks do standard training, consistent training in preparation for something like that if it were to pop up. More importantly, we have a police department of, I think, 67 sworn officers right now. That's not a small police department. We can bring a great deal of manpower to bear if there's an incident like that. But in addition to that, we have tremendous partnerships with Colleyville and Keller and Grapevine and Roanoke and Trophy Club, to where we have shared services with them. If something were to arise quickly, we can rally those folks very quickly to come, just like we'll come to them if they have an issue. And that goes beyond just police. That's a shared agreement with fire as well. If we have a large structural fire or some sort of major event, we're going to be there for each other. And that's one thing I'm really proud of, is the leadership, not only in Southlake, but across these cities working together.
Well, and again, these questions should be asked of every elected official everywhere in the country. It's not just a Southlake issue.
That's right.
Defend or defund the police?
Yeah, that's the easiest question of the day. I'll never defund our police department. I'm on the record many times as saying I will fund whatever is reasonably necessary to ensure that our police officers and firefighters are able to protect themselves, our residents, and our businesses. And that's critical. And I'll place an added specific emphasis on our children. My last year on council, the mayor asked me to work alongside our police chief and other leaders throughout the FBI, ATF, Secret Service, to form a school safety task force. And one of the actions we took was to allocate an additional $500,000, $500,000 to school safety, to allow us to fund additional SROs. Every campus has an SRO, and now our high school and senior high has 2 SROs.
What's an SRO for our audience?
Yeah, great. It's a school resource officer. That is a fully sworn police officer, member of the Southlake Police Department, employee of the city, that we allow the school district to use for school safety. And we pay those salaries and benefits.
Speaking of school safety, last question. We have an ever-growing, and not unique to Southlake, epidemic of drug abuse, opioid abuse, and suicides, specifically teen suicide. Knowing you're not on the school board, but how would you as a city council person work with the school community, the community as a whole, to really start to turn the tide on drug abuse and suicides?
Yeah, it's terrible, and we have to continue to address that. I think that's all about communication, ensuring these kids have opportunities to talk to adults, to talk to other kids, to ensure that they're never on an island. They're never in a place where they feel like they can't reach out for help and get assistance. I can tell you, too, it's interesting. We talked COVID at the beginning of this segment, and I do think that's an important factor in decision-making around COVID and around shutdowns and around schools. The consequences as a result of shutting down schools have to be considered. I'm not saying that there is not a place for those decisions, but it must be measured and it must be considered in balance with what happens to these kids when they're home alone and they're getting all this screen time. What's happening? Is bullying happening? Are they spending time on the computer instead of doing schoolwork? Are they experimenting with drugs and alcohol? There are major questions we need to be prepared to address as a result of some of these decisions.
Well, it's a big problem, without a doubt. And we've been speaking with Randy Williamson, who's a candidate for Southlake City Council, seat number 6. We appreciate you coming out today.
Yes, we sure do.
Hey, thanks, Tony and Russ. I appreciate it. And hopefully everybody will get out in early voting or November 3rd to cast a vote.